going to try and do for you just over the next 10 minutes is give you a perspective, hopefully perhaps try and fill in some gaps about GDPR if you're not sure all about what it is, to talk to you in particular about what it means for your customers, therefore, and how that rolls on to how it's going to affect their technology purchasing decisions, and try and relate that back to an element of what it means for you people as well. And I hope there'll be a few insights in there that maybe you might not yet have had an opportunity to consider. Now, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. The quote at the top was from one of the speakers at the event I mentioned just now, when he was at Technology. I was asked, how much bigger is this than what we do now? And you can see what he said: 100 times more obligations that you have to think about. You're probably all very familiar with the existing Data Protection Act. I'm sure you already have processes in place in terms of managing that. GDPR as the new EU data protection law isn't simply an extension of that. It is a major upgrade. It's a change to take into account the fact that the original data protection rules were made in a time before the internet was as pervasive as it is now, a time before social media, a time before big data, and GDPR is all about trying to update data protection regulations for a much more technology-enabled world. Now, there are a lot of key points around it, and there are a lot of new obligations, but I've just tried to pull out some of the key ones very quickly. First of all, clearly GDPR is about personal data of EU citizens, but where it changes from the previous regulations are that it is now about data of EU citizens regardless of where that data resides and regardless of where the organisation is. Current data protection rules say if you're an organisation in Europe dealing with EU citizens, you need to comply to these laws. What GDPR says, by contrast, is that wherever you are in the world, if you are storing information about an EU citizen, you need to store that information under the regulations of GDPR. So if you're based in the US and you're selling to a European audience, you are just as obligated to comply with GDPR, even if you have no physical presence in Europe whatsoever. It's a much broader perspective on where GDPR counts. Another big change is that GDPR says redefines the data that's affected by this to be any data that could potentially identify an individual. So it's not just specific information about a person. So, for example, this could include, if you're in pharmaceuticals, for example, this could include DNA data, where there is nothing with the data that says who this person is, where they live, or anything about them, but that data could be used to identify an individual. If you're in healthcare, for example, if you're selling anonymized data about medical records, which happens a lot, to research organizations, if that information could potentially be used to identify an individual, that's included as well. Also, if that data could potentially in future be used to identify an individual using as yet unspecified mechanism, that's counted as EU data as well. So the scope of what data is covered by this is very high. You'll be familiar already with the fact that consent is required for the use of personal data. The rules are much more stringent now on having proof of valid consent. It's much more stricter around things like implied consent, and you have to be able to demonstrate to the authorities that you have proof of consent and also what that consent is for. So it's not just a question of we've got consent to have their information, it's consent that we have their information and these are the specific things we have consent to be able to use it for. The new law introduces for the first time data breach notification. So this means that any organisation has to, by law, in the UK, for example, tell the Information Commissioner's Office or the equivalent privacy watchdog in other countries if they have had a data breach that affects any EU citizens' data. This effectively means that organisations who have managed to keep these sort of issues quiet in the past and now have a legal responsibility to tell the Information Commissioner that they've had a data breach. Data minimisation is extended as well. Data minimisation means, as already exists in the Data Protection Act, you're meant to only keep data for as long as you need it. Within GDPR, that's tightened up significantly tightened up. That has a real knock-on effect in terms of data. You have to know what data is for. You have to know how long you're allowed to keep it for, and you have to be able to prove that you have processes in place to get rid of the data when you no longer need it. Privacy by design is a big issue that's going to affect any of your customers who do software development. It's also going to affect you in terms of your product development. Privacy by design means you have to show that privacy is designed into any software or hardware systems that you produce as part of its design and not bolted on at the end. Big consideration. And for any of you thinking that, hey, we're coming out of the EU, Brexit's coming up, this doesn't affect us, is not the case. GDPR becomes effective on the 25th of May next year, so the UK is still going to be in the EU at that time, so all organisations in the UK will have to be GDPR compliant on 25th of May. Plus, the government has already said it's going to maintain GDPR once we come out of Brexit, come out of the EU, sorry, and also the UK is going to have to negotiate an agreement with the EU to ensure that EU citizens' data in the UK is handled the same level of specification as it is in the EU. Otherwise, UK companies might not be allowed to store that data. So one way or another, we are still going to be having GDPR in the UK. What it means to your customers. The quote here again from the person responsible for this at John Lewis from our event recently. The big way of thinking that changes around GDPR is that you have to think about data as if it is on loan from the individual. The law is quite specific about this. It's no longer the idea that you have gathered data and therefore you now own the data about that individual as long as you comply with data protection laws. The concept now is that data is on loan to you from the individual, and that changes the way you're thinking a lot. So for your customers, it means data location clearly becomes a big thing. It is hugely preferable if data is stored within the EU. There are ways that you can store it outside, but that's still very controversial. There's still a lot of legal debate going on about whether the existing practices in place with the United States, for example, will comply with GDPR. Those of you who are familiar with things like Safe Harbour and Privacy Shield will be familiar, no doubt, with some of that. It has a big knock-on effect, in particular around storage and backup. Individuals now have the right to be forgotten. So if somebody comes to you and says, "I want you to delete all the information that you have about me," you have to be able to prove that you can do that. That means every single item of information. So not just live information in your databases, but any copies on backups, any copies in archives. You have to be able to get rid of all that. The data minimization that I talked about is a big part of that, showing that you've got processes in place throughout your storage life cycle to be able to get rid of data that you no longer need. A big part of that is metadata management. It's not just going to be a question of having the data. You're going to have to retain lots of data about that data. So you're going to have to be able to say, for this individual's data, this is, for example, this is the consent we have. This is what we can do with this data. What all the permissions are, and be able to show that. In the security area, clearly with data breach notification, you're going to have to be able to show to the Information Commissioner's Office or equivalent that you've got the processes in place for things like data loss protection, things like security event management, to be able to show you've got processes in place to prevent data breaches and manage them when they do happen. Obvious knock-on effects there around data management and software and system design, particularly around the issue of privacy by design. For you, a big issue around data for IT marketers is that GDPR also says is very specific about the concept of a supply chain of data. So it effectively means that any data that you're using, you need to know the provenance of the supply chain of that data, the provenance of that data. You need to know all the metadata around it. You need to know all the validity of consent around it. So, for example, just to take a simple example, if you buy or have bought data from a list provider, for example, if you're doing list rental or buying data from a provider of names for lead generation, you need to be able to make sure that data provider has done all the things that they need to do under GDPR. If you buy that data from a list provider, and they haven't done that, you're making yourself liable for having data that is not GDPR compliant. It's no longer enough to be able to say, well, this company said to us it was GDPR compliant. If it turns out it's not, you have a legal responsibility to make sure that. It also happens the other way as well. If you're outsourcing some of your data, if you or your customers are giving data to an outsourcing company to manage or to a cloud company to manage, that the organisation that is doing the outsourcing remains legally responsible for making sure that data throughout that supply chain remains GDPR compliant. In every major sector of your customers, this is going to be affecting your customers. It's going to be particularly important, of course, to understand how it's going to affect your customers. Within our audience, our IT management audience, GDPR has very quickly risen up to become it's the number 2 most read topic on Computer Weekly at the moment. Number 1 is cybercrime and so forth. Not surprisingly, security is still the number 1, but data protection has very quickly risen to be the number one issue. And certainly, if you talk to any of our account team, they will tell you the number of people like yourselves, the number of our clients, that this has become a very big issue as well. So I would urge you to make sure that you're aware of what's different. 10 minutes in GDPR. There you go. Thank you.